Hey everybody, it's Timothy here with Jank Diver Gaming. This is the final video in a 5 video series where I rank all of the cards in the monocolored sections of the Unrestricted cube using this tier list, which you can participate in with by finding the link to this tier list down below. And you can fill in the tier list with your own thoughts, move the cards around however you want. Again, don't put a lot of faith in the rigidness of these descriptions here. It's just best to worst, pretty much, with the S tier being the absolute best of the best in a given color, and the D's being the cards that are possible to cut and don't fill super specific roles aren't necessary for the cube, and everything in between is kind of like a rough ranking of how you feel about the cards. It's a tier list. It's not super important. Like, just rank the cards however you feel like ranking them, you know? I will be reserving S for best of the best, and then my kind of baseline here is, would I first pick the card? If so, it's an A. If I wouldn't first pick it, it probably drops down to a B. And then D's are cards that I don't really think deserve the cube slots anymore, whether we've been playing with them for a while or not. Before we jump into that, as always, remember that you can find our content down below in the Jank Diver Gaming Discord, where we do our weekly drafts. We have unrestricted cube drafts using these cards on Sunday nights at 7:30 Eastern, and we have peasant cube drafts at 7:30 Eastern on Wednesday nights, which is meant for people with less wild cards and stuff like that. Sorry, I had to remove the clothing ad that just randomly popped up here. That being said, let's not spend too much time on the intro. I'm assuming if you're watching this one, you've watched some amount of the other ones and you kind of know what's going on here. So let's jump into some green cards and rank them in the tier list, starting off with the Mana Dorks. Now, before we actually start putting cards in slots, I should mention that green is our easy best color in terms of how often green decks are winning in our unrestricted cube right now, and we credit a lot of that due to the influx of 1-mana dorks. We're playing all of the 1-mana dorks on the client. For a longest time, all we had was Llanowar Elves and Gilded Goose, and everything was fine, but then we got Mystic, and then shortly after, Avacyn's Pilgrim and the newly printed Delighted Halfling. We got these all like at the same time, and green decks have just been dominated now that they have like a decent density of mana dorks. So we'll have to keep that in mind, but let's talk about all of the dorks together. Now, these three, Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, Avacyn's Pilgrim, there's always this interesting conversation. When you have a ramp deck that has a bunch of dorks and a bunch of top end, and you have a really tight strategy where your dorks get you to the top end, there's always this interesting back and forth about whether the dorks are the strongest cards in the deck or the things you're actually winning the game with are the strongest things in the deck. And it's always an interesting conversation, but there's not really a correct answer. I believe we have seen green decks become more dominant because the dorks exist, which to me makes me believe that the dorks are like the actual powerful cards that are making the deck tick. So we have Elvish Mystic, which you probably know these cards. Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves are roughly the same exact card. There we go. So, just mana dorks that tap for green. We have Llanowar Elves, which is roughly the same card. These are going to go in the same spot. And then I'm going to put Avacyn's Pilgrim in the exact same spot. It only taps for white mana, which is awkward, but you don't normally need, like, if you're playing these on green mana, you're probably good on green mana. Occasionally, it'll be annoying that you don't have a second green source and this doesn't tap for green, but for the most part, they all accelerate you forward a turn and doesn't really matter what mana they're tapping for. So my question is, do they belong in S tier or do they belong in A tier? And that's an interesting conversation because they are super powerful and they're mostly replaceable. If we had 9 or 10 of them in the cube, they probably wouldn't be S tier because they would be replaceable, but you do have to spend early picks on them. They don't necessarily wheel as they shouldn't wheel necessarily, but if we had 7 or 8 of them, the more of them you have, the less important any particular one gets. But because we don't have a high density of them, you have to draft them highly. You have to get them when you can because there's only so many of them to go around. So I want to say these are like S tier. Maybe this one's like A tier because it's just slightly worse. But it is very hard for me to quantify like whether the dorks belong in the top or whether they they belong like a step below the actual things that you're ramping into. And I'm going to say like the decks are just better when you have these cards, that they are S tier. It sounds a little bit weird because their power level is limited, but as long as we only have these ones to choose from, I think they're so important to the cube and so important to the green section that you have to respect how they make these decks tick. The green decks without the dorks and the green decks with the dorks feel like night and day. If you take the exact same deck with 3 of these mana dorks and you sub the mana dorks out for just different mid-rangey creatures or 2 mana dorks, the deck feels significantly worse. So I am going to start with these up in S tier, which is wild. It's just wild. Next up is Gilded Goose. So I don't mind Gilded Goose. It is the worst of the mana dorks by a decent amount. If you talk to Chris is going to talk about Gilded Goose as though it's like an F quality card. He loses a lot of sleep over Gilded Goose for some reason. He has like a vendetta against the card, but you know, I think part of that's just it's not one of these dorks and he wants it to be so bad. I think it's fine, and it is a serviceable mana dork. If you don't get the other ones, which you should prioritize higher, Gilded Goose does a fine job. Sometimes that one instance of mana acceleration is all you need. And this does have the added benefit of sometimes just being this like life gain factory in the late game where you tap it, pay 4 mana, and gain 3 life, and that can stave off some late game attacks. So it has some added utility, which doesn't really budge its rank in that much, but low A is probably fine. It was more of like a high A, low S before we got the other mana dorks, which fielded it out, which again, you know, speaks to what I'm saying, where the more mana dorks you have, the less important any individual one is. Delighted Halfling. This one actually does only tap for colorless. I hate that. There we go. So this one's a little awkward because we're at the point where we're not going to give up on a mana dork. If we got another 2 tomorrow, we would probably play them. But it does have this clause that like randomly hoses blue counter magic. And we've already mentioned that blue is the the worst color, or struggling a little bit. Due to the, you know, how the ceiling on its counter magic is not that high. So when you get random cards that you want to play, but they also just have random hoser text for counter magic, it's kind of like, this is annoying, but we're not going to give up on it. I think this one also belongs up here in the conversation. I'm not sure where it stands. I guess the 1/2 body might make this just the best mana dork. It doesn't tap for colored mana most of the time, but there are incidentally just enough legendary creatures and legendary spells that this is going to make one of those things cheaper. It can make like your Great Henge or your Embercleave uncounterable, which is kind of funny. There just is coincidentally a ton of legendaries. Also Planeswalkers, those are always legendary, so your opponent can't counter your Planeswalkers, which is great. Lotus Cobra, I've defended this card a lot, but I think I'm starting to agree with people that it's a little bit farther down the rankings. It is like high C, low B mana dork because the mana it generates is never guaranteed. It can do the most explosive things of any of the 2 mana accelerants, but that's not guaranteed. If you just play a land, it's doing exactly what, you know, Paradise Druid or any of these other 2 mana accelerants are doing. If you have like a Fabled Passage, it can do some really powerful things, and there's cards like Harrow and stuff like that that can give you extra land drops. But as just a normal use case thing, it can't accelerate you farther than 1 ahead. Hi, Dad. So I am going to say that Lotus Cobra is slowly fielding itself out. The more reliable 2 mana dorks that just always give you mana no matter what are noticeably better than Lotus Cobra, even if this one has the higher ceiling. Scavenging Ooze. Tried and true, Scavenging Ooze. This is what I like Graveyard Hate to look like. It has a cost associated with it. It doesn't completely hose the graveyard. It does, but you need to time it correctly. It's on a body that's pretty easy to kill for the most part. Scavenging Ooze, solid B. You don't need it in any deck. You're never actively looking for it, but once you get down to like your 21st, 22nd, 23rd playable, you're happy to slot it in with Scavenging Ooze. And it does give the cube a little bit of a safety valve against some of the graveyard heavy recursion stuff that's going on. Not that that's like a huge contender. Paradise Druid. This is my pick for the best of the 2 mana dorks, just because it almost guarantees that you get that mana. Hexproof, when your opponent is holding up a removal spell and you slam Paradise Druid and they can't kill it, you just feel so good, right? Because you know you're going to get that mana. Kind of like a Sylvan Caryatid, but we don't have access to that card. Also, it can trade off if need be. It can rumble. It's a body. It always guarantees that you accelerate from 2 to 4, which is nice. So I'm going to put this in high A. I actually think it's better than Goose. Goose being a step below these other 1-mana dorks. Paradise Druid, the mana dorks that you can cast with a lot of certainty that you're going to get to use them are better than the ones that die to like the bolts and stuff like that. So next up is Curion Beastcaller. Fine little 2-drop, a little bit narrow. You have to be a heavy creature deck. You don't necessarily want this in your ramp decks, but I think we're at the point where our dedicated green ramp decks are pretty distinct from our like beat down, stompy mid-range decks. Basically, you have decks that want 2-drops, 3-drops, and 4-drops that can attack, and then you have decks that don't really want to attack in the early game at all and just want to cast 5-drops, 6-drops, and 7-drops. And Beastcaller fits into the former of those two categories. So it's just a solid little B. I think most of the time I would take Skoos over it just because Skoos gives you a little more interaction. But Beastcaller leads to some really powerful curve outs in like Selesnya decks and stuff like that. This one is Llanowar Loam Speaker. Solid little mana dork. We like when our mana dorks have big butts. It means they get to dodge like the Pillar of Flames and stuff like that. And they're just more likely to be able to untap. The added text on this one is not like completely irrelevant. It's somewhere in the middle. Like sometimes if the coast is clear, you'll just send in a 3/3 at your opponent. It's fine. Like that added text is not amazing, but it is something on top of a card you're already willing to play. If this didn't have that text, I don't think we'd be talking about it, but having your mana dorks be relevant early and relevant late is really nice. It's still like a high B. I think I'm going to reserve the A list for just the best of the mana accelerants, the ones that are harder to kill. But as far as 2 mana accelerants go, you're happy to have a Llanowar Loam Speaker. Dusk Watch Recruiter. Not day and night. It's so awkward to have daybound, nightbound werewolves and just regular werewolves in the same cube, but I didn't make the mechanics. We just play with the cards. This one I think has been an underperformer. Again, mana sinks that don't affect the board are kind of hard to use. Now, if you're in a green deck that can just produce tons of mana, Duskwatch Recruiter is great. Obviously, you can run this out on turn 2, and sometimes your opponent doesn't have a play, and you just get spotted the Krowlin Horde Howler. I do think this card has underperformed, though, and I think it's just the nature of mana sinks. When everybody is just casting powerful spells, and you cast a powerful spell, your opponent casts a powerful spell, you guys are playing a bunch of stuff that gives you card advantage, you almost always have stuff to do with your mana, and you're very rarely in a position where the correct thing to spend your mana on is this ability. Although it does play good against counter magic, which is not necessarily great for us. We want our counter magic to work. We don't want it to not work. So I think this card is fine. You can put it in a deck, but just not a super important part of any green deck. It's not propelling a strategy forward, especially when you look at all the card advantage you get on some of these other green cards. Armored Scrap Gorger. Again, 3 toughness. This is kind of like a hybrid between the Llanowar Loam Speaker and the Skoos. I actually value quite a bit that it can exile cards from the graveyard, although there's like this little bit of an awkward thing where you don't actually get an oil counter on it if there's no cards in the graveyard, and sometimes you actually have to eat your own cards. So there's some weird things going on with it, but as incidental graveyard hate on a body that we're already interested in playing that acts as an accelerant, I think it's pretty decent, and I will put it right in the middle. It feels like a hybrid of these two cards, right? So it feels appropriate to put it in the middle. Lovestruck Beast. I think the final adventure card I get to talk about. It's good, but it's polarizing. The matchups that this card is good in are the aggro matchups, and then it's like miserable against control or anything that can just pick off the 1/1. It is right in the middle for me. We have had conversations about cutting it before. I'm going to put it at low B because a lot of times you can just play a dork and then ramp to a 4-drop and ignore this sort of card altogether. But against the aggro decks, just being 2 bodies in one of which is like this huge 5/5 that's hard to get out of the way, it can really swing that matchup in your favor. And it is the best creature for getting the Great Henge online early, which matters a decent amount. So low B. I wouldn't be surprised if we find a cut for this card somewhere down the line. Selvala, pet card of mine. This is Of all my like 20 commander decks, this is probably my best one. So obviously it's a pet card, but I'm going to give it a D. And the reason is I think we have plenty of creatures that just do the acceleration and thing on 3. This sometimes draws your opponent's cards, which is annoying, even though you should be primed to draw cards off of it more annoying. And it's more cute than it is powerful or necessary. Obviously, this card can do the most powerful ramp stuff in the entire cube, where you have like a 6/6 on board, and this is tapping for 6 or 7 mana or whatever. And that feels great, but it doesn't really get to do that often. On its own, it does tap for mana. Like it nets you 1 extra mana with nothing else on board, but so do some of these other cards that are just a little more consistent. So I think Sylvala's time is probably up, and she had a good run. She did some powerful things. I think she's a dud more often than not, and playing a card that like draws your opponent a card is never a good idea, even if you're hoping that doesn't really happen. Tireless Tracker. Another reward from the fantastic Shadows over Innistrad remaster. Just great card advantage card. This is like maybe the perfect mid-range card and like one of the most perfect designs in Magic ever, where it gives you long-term advantage, but it starts off at a reasonable cost. 3 mana, 3/2. If this was made in like 2023, it'd be like a 3 mana, 3/3 or 3/4 or something. And I like when your cards that carry you throughout the late game aren't necessarily just overstated cards already. There's a little bit of a give and a pull here, and this card does justify its spot, so much so that I think it's like a high quality A. Maybe not as crucial as Mana Acceleration, but certainly just as powerful in the late game. It's just a fun card to play with. People love Tireless Tracker. Llanowar Visionary. Just random common. This card was designed, I think, as a joke, right? Because it's Llanowar Elves plus Elvish Visionary in one card. It has both their abilities, but it just performs really well. It's a solid bread and butter type card. Again, hard for me to give it a higher grade than the 2 mana dorks, because those are just more premium than a 3 mana dork. But as far as the value you get off of this card and the acceleration go, it is just a rock solid card. I'm going to put it right below the 2 drops that tap for mana. But still keep it fairly high because you can just throw it in a green deck and it'll be good. Rishkar is in a very similar boat. In fact, Rishkar was just printed at Uncommon in Commander Masters, so it got downshifted. It is now Peasant Cube viable. Maybe not in ours, but in most Peasant Cubes. Rishkar is interesting. It is noticeably worse than Llanowar Visionary a lot. But it does have some really powerful play patterns where you just go 1 drop or a 2 drop into Rishkar and you add 4 power to the board and you have some extra mana acceleration. So again, it's a B. It's a fine little B, probably below Skooz. Again, just not as important as a card when you have all of the 1 and 2 mana acceleration flowing around. Replaceable, not an important part of any deck, but powerful enough to take its spot. At the very minimum, it's a 3 mana 3/3 that taps for green, and it sometimes does cool things with other creatures with counters on them. Voracious Hydra. This is the card that always gets me out of green. I always think I'm doing fine, and then they play this for like X's 5, kill my thing. It's good. This card I think is very strong, very flexible, but not so much so that it's broken or needs to be taken out. In fact, I think it's been here the entire time we've had the Unrestricted Cube, and I'm going to put it at A. I think the power level of the card is quite nice. A lot of times it's just like ETB Fight a Thing, which we don't play a lot of those cards now that we removed Kogla, but sometimes you also just run it out and double the counters on it, and it's like an 8/9 or something like that, and that's a problem. What is it, 5 mana 8/9 or 6 mana 8/9 with Trample? It's a pretty strong card, even if more often than not you just 2-for-1 your opponent with the fight ability. Augur of Autumn. So let's go ahead and talk about 2 cards together. We have Augur of Autumn, which is the one that needs Coven to just rattle cards off the top of your library, but always lets you play lands off the top. And then there is a Centaur Courser, Courser of Kruphix. We're not playing Centaur Courser. This one has a bigger butt. It gains you life when lands into the battlefield, but only lets you play lands. And then, of course, it's an enchantment, which is a downside, just makes it more vulnerable to removal, like Gemrazor. So these cards are very comparable. I tend to think the 4 toughness on Courser Kruphix is a little better. I'm actually not the hugest fan of Augur of Autumn, but I know it has its fans here. I would personally put Augur at like high C. because green, I mean, just look, green has card advantage tools, right? It's no contest for me whether I want Tireless Tracker or Augur Rotom. I want Tireless Tracker every single time, but I think some people would dispute that. And I think when you get creatures that come in, do something, and then replace themselves, like the Llanowar Visionary, it makes the Augur a little less necessary because it just doesn't engage in combat that well. I will give Courser of Krufix a slight nudge above that. Let's actually go ahead and put it right below Scavenging Ooze and Rishkar, because the life gain on this one's important. This one's just a much better card at stabilizing and keeping you alive to the point where you get a benefit off of this and your other cards like Augur. That extra life gain comes in handy. A lot of times Courser of Krufix is holding back a creature or two and just gains you like 2 or 3 life. And when you play a land off the top of your library, that is card advantage. So Augur, I respect Augur. Once you get Coven going and you can just rattle off cards, it's really strong, but that doesn't come up super often, and green has plenty of card advantage without Augur. So I will give the nod to Courser here. Bloated Contaminator. Ridiculous card. Ridiculous card. We invited the Lucky Paper Magic people on to draft with us, or rather, they invited us onto their podcast, and we invited them to a draft to get a feel for what we were doing. And I had somebody go, I forget who I played against, but they went like Elf into Bloated Contaminator on turn 2, and I was like, okay, I'm dead. This is, I think, like the only 3-mana 4/4 that's just like upside. You can ignore Toxic on this card, but 3-mana 4/4 Trample Proliferate on attacks. Like, what? Where's the downside? There is none. And the fact that we have all these 1-mana dorks now means you can reliably cast this on turn 2. This is a high A. I think as far as beaters go, it's one of the best, so I'm going to put it in the middle of A. Gem Razor, just thinking about this card the other day. I think Gem Razor is coming to its inevitable end here soon. We have some amount of artifact and enchantment destruction. I've mentioned this almost every video. It's important to have a few effects that can interact with artifacts and enchantments, even if they're not a big player, because there are things like Great Henge and Rangers class floating around, and you want to make sure people have outs to cards like that. But we have like Boseiju taking up a slot here. We don't really need to dedicate anything to Gem Razor, and we've got equally powerful 4-mana 4/4s floating around, so... Gem Razor is a cool card. It's been here for a long time, but I don't think it's necessary anymore. It's being fielded out by the other 4s. Ulvenwald Oddity is up next. Speaking of 4-mana 4/4s, this one has Trample and Haste. This is an Adult Gold Dragon. That's the award I give to creatures that don't have a lot of text on them, but they're still powerful. It just feels nice to read the card and know what it does. And of course, this has like the Crater Hoof Behemoth-y type text on it as well, which we cut Crater Hoof Behemoth, but it's nice to still have a similar effect like that stapled to a creature. This is what the mid-rangey creatures or mid-rangey green decks are all about, are these 4-mana beaters like Questing Beast and Ulvenwald Oddity. You just want to play your 2-mana dork, play these things on turn 3, and just keep smashing with aggressive creatures. So a little bit distinct from the all-in ramp decks that really want to get to the 6 and 7 drops. These ones are fine to just start playing mid-rangey 4 drops. And I think Ulvenwald Oddity is just a fine little B creature. Probably less important than like a Courser of Krufix. So low B feels nice. Radagast of the Brown. Card advantage tool, like I said. I just think cards like this are less important when you have card advantage stapled to ETBs. We experimented with this one. We weren't 100% sure how it would play out, but we've had some testing with it, and Chris and Tell have reported that it plays out really well. It's kind of like a Beast Whisperer with 5 toughness. And the fact that you get to look really deep into your library every time a creature hits the board, and this is an Avatar Wizard itself, and you get selection over the next type of creature you're going to cast, means that this translates to when a creature enters the battlefield, draw a card more often than not. And it's a card that holds down the 4 or 5 toughness is a really big bar to cross in this cube, because we do play a lot of red removal like Stoke the Flames and Obliterate and Bolt that can take out the 4 toughness creatures. So this one might end up being more important than a lot of the other card advantage tools that we have. I'm going to start it off fairly highly, probably above Scooz and below the Mana Accelerants, and just keep an eye on how good it is. Questing Beast. The card with all the text. Less text than Radagast, actually. Questing Beast is very similar to Ulvenwald Oddity, but punches through a lot of the annoying stuff that gets to chump block. Yes, this card has trample, but this card can't be blocked by a bunch of little things in the first place. So I like it kind of in the same spot as Ulvenwald Oddity, but just given the nudge to it. I do think these cards are a little bit better than Rishkar. Let's go ahead and move Rishkar down below the 4-drops. And let's keep Courser high like that. That looks good. Doomscar Warrior, again, same thing. 4-drop with added text and card advantage. This one just so happens to have some counter synergies and trample and stuff like that. It's a powerful card on its own, but a lot of times you can sneak in that backup, put that counter on another creature that has a good attack that turn, and then get an extra card off of it. This one might end up being better than Radagast. It's the more proactive version of Radagast, whereas Radagast is a reactive version or a defensive version of card advantage. This one lets you actually apply pressure while drawing cards, whereas Radagast doesn't really contribute to combat. So I'm going to put this in the same category, but just slightly above it. I missed this card during spoiler season. I think I read it and I was like, wow, that's a boring green creature. And then someone pointed out that, like, hey, this is just a 4-mana 5/4 trample that draws cards when it hits. And I was like, oh, okay. Green 5-drops. So we're in an interesting spot with these because we were playing some really powerful ones like Vorinclex, the March of Machines Vorinclex, and Elder Gargaroth, and it was very clear that like green just had these ridiculous Baneslayer type creatures that not only punished your opponent and like killed them in 2 or 3 hits, but also gave you a bunch of advantage while doing it. And we cut back on those a little bit. I will say we quote unquote nerfed our 5-drop slot a little bit. We left the Defiler there as a powerful, 5-mana 6/6. But our whole green section was like 5-mana 6/6s with massive upside, and we decided to trim on that a little bit for diversity. Cavalier of Thorns came in to kind of, relieve other players of having to deal with 5-mana 6/6s for a little while, and this one's just fine. It's a little more defensive, but it attacks and blocks well. It gives you extra advantage on ETB and death. It's a solid little creature. It's not like the ramp target of choice necessarily, but it is the mid-rangey ramp deck, or in the mid-rangey ramp deck that wants to just skip the 3-drop, 4-drop section. You can ramp into this, and it gives you the extra mana to ramp into something big like the Titan of Industry. So I think this is B tier, and high B tier. It usually does bring the game to a crawl. Let's go ahead and stick it above Skoos. I think it's regularly better than that. Workshop War Chief. Great stabilizer against aggro decks, just altogether. Good card, very reminiscent of Thragtusk, but plays out differently. Blitz is a fun mechanic to play with. Just well-rounded card. It's vulnerable, 5/3, but it leaves behind some value. Again, creature that plays combat very well, does stuff on entering the battlefield, does stuff when it leaves, stabilizes, does just a lot of different hats, and for that reason, is going to go into high B as well. It's kind of hard to go wrong with cards like this. We'll stick it in the same area as Doomscar Warrior, because it kind of plays this similar role to that. Defiler. 5-mana 6/6s. Turns out those are good when they have trample and sometimes throw a bunch of extra counters on your creatures. Also makes cards like Wolfwill Haven and Ranger class a lot better because those are permanents with green pips that you can cast for cheaper. Basically, if your opponent doesn't kill Defiler right away and you have any sort of board and any sort of permanent to cast in your hand, your board just gets out of hand so fast. So I think Defiler on stats alone is a B, and then its ability puts it over the top, and I think it's like a high C. Might even be like a little bit higher than that, but I think high C is a good place to be. And you are at a point where, like, if you're in a green deck, you almost don't even care what your top end threats are. You just care that you can slam top end threats. So Defiler is the best of those at the 5-drop slot, at least the best one that we're still playing, but it's interchangeable with a lot of other stuff. Battle Mammoth is one of the worst ones. Again, 6/5 trample for 5. You can cast it on turn 4. With the right kind of setup, you could even cast it on turn 3 with these dorks. It's fine. Like, it punishes your opponents for targeting your stuff. It's not an impressive creature. It's not a broken creature. It's just a perfectly fine one. It is here as like a placeholder. Again, we wanted to cut back the power level of the 5-drops, and this is what we came to. So it's more like a C-level card where there are better options, but we're intentionally not playing the better options. So once things even out and, green isn't winning at such a ridiculous clip, we'll probably get rid of Battle Mammoth for, a slightly better 5-drop, which we do have access to. Primeval Titan. Talk about this one for just a second. I think Primeval Titan sucks. I think it's probably the worst card in the green section. Well, one of the worst cards in the green section. We are trying it out for nostalgia's sake, but it is Colossal Dreadmaw for the most part for us. It's not impressive. The things that you need to make Primeval Titan good, or the things that have traditionally made Primeval Titan good, are either really expensive top end, like 9 drops and 10 drops and 11 drops, like the Eldrazi and stuff like that, or powerful utility lands like Valakut, Field of the Dead. And we're not doing either of those two things. So the benefit of Primeval Titan is that it just thins out your deck and gives you extra mana, which might set you up for some double spell turns, which is great and all. If you can play Primeval Titan on like turn 5 and then the next turn double spell because you have 8-9 mana or whatever, that's great. But I think this card is a little bit too vulnerable to removal at its cost, and doesn't really do anything special in the cube other than thin out your deck a little bit, which adds up over time, but only does so much. So we're experimenting with the card. There was a lot of debate about whether this one should be in the cube or not. I don't think it will be long term, but we are going to play with the card for a little bit just because it's a card that people enjoy. And the floor is like high enough at 6 mana, 6/6 trample that it's not super embarrassing, even if like the upside isn't really there. Speaking of Vorinclex, this is the 6 mana Vorinclex. We cut the 5 mana one. Trample haste. I mean, just compare Primeval Titan to this Vorinclex. Like, you just get to attack right away with your card instead of filtering your land a little bit. This Vorinclex, I think, is really powerful. It belongs in B range, maybe even A range, like low A. Probably less important than the Dorks. And it lets you do some nasty things with Planeswalkers. It also randomly hoses your opponent's Planeswalkers. We've seen it come up a couple times where you have Vorinclex on board and your opponent's answer is Ugin, but Ugin actually comes down with half as many counters and no longer has enough counters to minus and kill Vorinclex. So this card randomly messes up a lot of things while also just bolstering your own things like sagas and stuff. It shuts off your opponent's sagas. It does enough incidental stuff that like we're not really intentionally playing it for, but enough stuff to make it a powerful card. And then, of course, Colossal Dreadmaw with haste, when you get that first attack in and you can circumvent just a clean removal spell, obviously bumps this up a decent amount. So Vorinclex, fine. Good ramp target, good beatdown target at the 6-drop slot. Similar to Tovolar's Huntmaster, which I mentioned when we talked about Grave Titan in the black section. Tovolar's Huntmaster, 6 mana, 6/6, makes some 2/2s, like 10 power, 10 toughness across 3 bodies. If anyone ever like passes a turn without casting a spell and this gets to make 2 more 2/2s and fight some stuff, the game's probably over. That doesn't happen that much, but it is another premium ramp target. Not an uncuttable one. There are other 6-drops we could play, but they tend to be unfun cards like Averbrook Caretaker and Carnage Tyrant that we don't really want to play. So while I think this one's probably a little bit worse than Vorinclex, it's in the same category. It's a better stabilizer, but doesn't have as much of an immediate impact. I guess it sometimes has a better impact. They're the same. They're the same. This one plays defense a lot better and plays offense roughly about the same, whereas Vorinclex does more combo-y things and is a little bit more disruptive. So they could occupy the spot, take it or leave it, whichever order you want to put this in. And then Titan of Industry is our dedicated ramp target for now. Just one of the best things that you can ramp to in the card pool. And 7 is much more reasonable than 8. We do have some other ramp targets we could play. We played Craterhoof for a while. We played Hornet Queen for a while. They all feel fine, and we do have the mana to make them work. But Titan of Industry is the best value-oriented one and kind of like splits the hairs. It plays offense and defense exceptionally well. Titan of Industry is going to go ahead and get a high A for me. We'll go ahead and put it below the Defiler, and the Contaminator is just a beast. So might literally be a beast. Titan of Industry as the premium ramp target besides like maybe Ugin is going to get a high vote for me. Next up is Wrenn and Realmbreaker. We got 3 Planeswalkers here. This was one of the most overhyped cards during spoiler season. People were very, very high on it, and I was very, very low on it. And I think the actuality is somewhere in the middle. I don't like the card that much, although a turn 3 Ren and Realm Breaker can be a little bit obnoxious for people to deal with. It's not great later in the game. If you draw this on like turn 4 or 5, it's like okay, but never exceptional. And then like you don't get to -7. It does fix you. It gives you like that chromatic lantern thing, but that only really matters for the like multicolor, 4-color, 5-color decks, which should just have great fixing anyway. So it's a fine card. It's a little mid-rangey, but I'm going to keep advocating for cutting this card at some point because I just find it completely unexciting. It's okay. Like there's not too much I can say bad about it, but I also think the ceiling on it's capped at like just okay. Vivian, Monsters Advocate. Great card. Just 5-mana Planeswalker that spits out a 3/3, and he almost always has Reach or Vigilance. You don't really ever give the thing Trample, but that means it plays offense and defense. It does the, play out the top of your library thing. The -2 actually comes up a lot, where you play this, you plus it, the next turn you -2, cast a 6-drop, go find a 5-drop. Just very powerful stuff. Well-rounded Planeswalker that puts pressure on your opponent, plays defense quite well. It's a powerful card, gives you card advantage. Like I don't know what else you want out of a card if those aren't the things. I could see ramping into a Defiler or a Vivian and being equally happy either way. Obviously Defiler is going to close out the game quicker, but Vivian has more longevity against removal and sweepers and stuff like that. So let's put them roughly in the same category. And then talk about Nissa Who Shakes the World, which I'm just going to put here as S tier, probably the best green card in the cube. This card is a monster. The amount of mana it makes is just ridiculous while also putting pressure on your opponent. I mean, compared to Vivian, which they both like plus to make 3/3s, this one just gives you twice as much mana while making it. I have played the game where my opponent ramps into Nissa off of like mana dorks and doesn't actually have a bunch of lands, and I just try to remove their lands as they animate them, and it seems like they still just never run out of mana. Nissa, just absolutely fundamentally broken card, I think, and just one of the best things you can ramp into. Obviously, if you skip like turns 2 and 3 and you land Nissa on turn 3 or 4 or whatever, and then that card ramps you up to like your 6s and 7s and 8s on its own. So very powerful, force to be reckoned with. There was even in the conversation at some point about cutting it just because of how ubiquitously good it was in green. Primal Might. Talk about the fight spells here. Well, I guess the other ones are instants, but Primal Might's fine. It's like a fireball that punches something. We found these fight spells to be decent. I don't know. Sometimes this card is like green X, fireball you and kill a creature, and then it looks amazing. But a lot of times you can just run it out for cheap to, double spell during the same turn, get a threat off the board. As long as you're not running it out into open mana, you should be fine. And you can almost always find an opportunity to cast this. So I think this is like a solid removal spell. Green doesn't have access to a lot of removal spells, but the ones it does have access to tend to be pretty good. Let's go ahead and throw it above Skoos. You usually want 1 or 2 of these fight spells in your green decks. Abundant Growth. The cantrips. Wait, that's not it. Abundant Harvest? There we go. This card is obnoxious because it's a rare on Arena, even though it's very clearly a common, but they got to get your wild cards. Okay, let's have the discussion here about the cantrips. I'll just move all 5 of them together. There is Abundant Harvest, which never misses. You cast it, you choose land or non-land, you always get the thing you're looking for. There's Elven Farsight, which can only cantrip into a creature, but lets you scry 3, set things up. Can't cantrip into a land, but you can set a land on top. This is one of the contentious ones that we've added recently. There's Seed of Hope, which I think is just garbage. Like, not garbage in the sense that like you can't put it in a deck, but compared to the other ones, I think it's like easily the worst of all of these, just because it doesn't mill that much. Like, you only get to look at 2 cards. You gain a little bit of life, but you have such little selection off of this one, and this one is the most likely to miss out of all of them that I'm just not a fan of it. There's Battle or Invasion of Ixalan, which is a permanent. That matters. It looks 5 deep, it picks up any permanent, and then it can transform into a Belligerent or Regisaur if you put in the work to actually get it flipped, which some of the red cards can do that. And then there's finally Once Upon a Time, which raised a lot of contention lately. There was a lot of argument about whether Once Upon a Time was the best of these cantrips, the worst of these cantrips, whether it was better or worse than Farsight. I'm just going to go ahead and give my opinion on all of these real quick. I think Abundant Growth is the best because it just never misses. And I think it's an A quality level card that you can put in any deck. Let's go ahead and stick it here. I think Once Upon a Time is the next best and comparable. Your decks just are a lot better when they have this, because in the late game, you can just turn this into another card. In the early game, you usually have other stuff to do, so you're not forced to cast this. And then in your open in hand, it just guarantees that you get to play a game of Magic. Elven Farsight, I think, is passable. I talk about this card like it's a D. If you talk to Chris and Tell, they're going to like act like it's an S. But realistically, I think if everybody just, takes a step back from hyperbole and ranks it where it should be, I think it falls into the B category, like just smack dab in the B category. Probably less important than the Mana Dorks, less important than the most expensive big game finishers, but probably more useful than generic 4-mana creatures and stuff like that. Invasion of Ixalan is the one I don't know how well it plays because I haven't played with a ton of battles in Cube, but I have to imagine it's in very similar territory to Once Upon a Time. It being a permanent is also quite nice, so I'm going to stick it with Once Upon a Time. This gets my nod for right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if this one takes over. It does really rely on how often it's flipping into a creature. If it's never flipping into a creature, I think Once Upon a Time is significantly better, but it's, I've yet to see how often you get to transform battles. And then Seed of Hope, I think, is like, probably shouldn't even be in the cube. People are gung-ho about these cantrips. I think they need to temper expectations a little bit. Like, yeah, it's great to cast a card and get a little bit of selection and turn it into another card, but there is a ceiling on what that can do. It makes your deck a little more consistent, but at some point, like, you have consistency in a few of these cantrips. Putting like 10 of them in your deck wouldn't make any sense, so there's clearly a line to be drawn, and I think Seed of Hope or whatever is where I draw that line. So just my thoughts. Honestly, this could be like a C. You can just throw it in a deck, and it'll do something, but it's not an important draft pick. You just don't need it. All right. I could spend a lot of time on those cantrips, but we've already hashed that out in the Discord if you want to come talk about it. Tyvar's Stand is very similar to Primal Might in that it can fireball your opponent, just turn all your mana into damage, but it plays defense. It's here to play defense, and it's fine at doing that. It is interesting whether or not we need to dedicate a slot to an effect like this. We have played things like Snakeskin Veil and Heroic Intervention in the past and just determined that they're not necessary cards, but that they're fine to play. A lot of times they end up coming in out of the sideboard, but this one has a little bit more utility on offense, and I think it overperformed our expectations. I'm not even sure what prompted us to put it in the cube in the first place, but it is in the cube, and it does an okay job at what it's supposed to do, although it is a slot that can be used for something else down the line. Not a necessary card, but it works fine. If you draft it, it should be good. Inscription of Abundance. Yeah. Okay. This is the best fight spell in my opinion. We have the Primal Might, we have Inscription. I think we had another one at some point. These might be the only two, but this one is very flexible. You can just run it out as a 2-mana spell to get some counters and win a combat or fight something. The 5-mana mode, if you get to it and you can pull it off, just completely turns the game around every single time. Again, it's questionable how important it is to have these fight spells, but I do like this one a little bit more than Primal Might. If I'm looking for a green removal spell, I'm happy to pick up either one, though, so I'll put them right next to each other. Harrow. We played Cultivate, we played Settle the Wilds, we played a lot of different 3-mana ramp effects. How important is it that your deck has a Harrow? I would say if you're the 4 or 5 color deck, or you're just a 3 color deck splashing and you need some fixing, you can pick up Harrow and it'll be fine. Very similar to a Cultivate, less important than like a 3-mana Dork that accelerates you, so I'm going to say this is in the same category as some of the mass acceleration, but probably like worse than creature permanent-based ramps. So I'll put it near Rishkar, but give the nod to the permanent that does it. Court of Colin, another contentious one that we just got a hold of. So my opinion with Court of Colin is that it can do some really cool things. It's not a necessary card for the cube, so it absolutely goes in C territory, probably top of C. I think it would be fine, never super impressive, but never terrible either. We got some opinions when this card came out that it's absolute trash, which I don't understand that. I think there's plenty of ways to make Court of Colin an excellent card in your deck, even though I don't think this is going to be one of the best cards. Like, you're not supposed to first pick Court of Colin or anything like that. So experimenting with it in the same vein as experimenting with Primeval Titan, with the expectation that neither of these cards are going to last for that long. We just want to play them because they're classic effects, and we want to see if they surprise us in the cube. The Great Henge. So one of the features of not playing a lot of dedicated disenchant type effects is that when you stick an artifact or enchantment, a lot of times you can rely on it sitting on the battlefield. If you can stick the Great Henge, there aren't a lot of ways to blow it up. Most of the ways that blow it up are green, and you're the green player, so you get to snipe those effects out of the mana base. And then there's random things like Hopeful Initiate and Abrade. But the Great Henge is a game plan in and of itself, and one of the best things that green can do is just play a big creature on 4 and then play the Great Henge on 5, and then you just don't die to damage because you gain 2 life every turn. You can cast all of your spells for the rest of the game because of the ramp. You get all of this card draw, and all of your creatures come in bigger. It's kind of a messed up card. This is Eldraine like through and through. If you want to know how Eldraine shaped Magic the Gathering, just look at this card. It was like everything needs to do more. Why can't we make it do more? And it's kind of frustrating that like this green card gets to do everything, but it's powerful. A lot of people first pick this card and stake a claim on green, and I don't think they're necessarily wrong to do so. If you sit down at a table and you're like, you know what, I'm drafting green no matter what, you'd be happy to first pick a Great Henge. 3 more cards. Wolf Willow Haven. I'm going to put this close to Paradise Druid, although I think on average it's a little bit weaker because it doesn't really engage in combat. But the fact that it's a mana accelerant, let's go ahead and stick it above Voracious Hydra. The fact that this is a mana accelerant that your opponent can't really do anything about on turn 2 just means that if you cast this on turn 2, you're all but guaranteed your mana on turn 3, right? And you can cast your 4-drop. Whereas your Loam Speakers and your Scrap Gorgers and stuff like that, sometimes they just eat a Fatal Push or a Lightning Bolt, and now you're actually playing a fair game of Magic. Wolf Willow Haven's not broken because the upside of it is something that just doesn't matter that much or doesn't come up that often, whereas something like Paradise Druid kind of gives you the same security of getting your mana on turn 3, but can actually engage in combat if you need it to. So I do like Paradise Druid a good deal more than Wolf Willow Haven, but I think Wolf Willow Haven, if you're drafting it at a lower clip than some of these other creatures, I think you should probably adjust that and swap them around a little bit. Ranger class. Card that I will humbly admit I was wrong about. Still don't think it's super powerful. I think people exaggerated just how powerful this card is because of the amount of mana you need to sink into it. But if you think about this as a bear with like pretty strong upside, then yeah, that's kind of the selling point for it. It's one of the best 2-drops you can play. I think it's a little bit of a trap to play this on turn 2 and then immediately go for level 2 and just hope that gets there if you're playing against an opponent who's showing you colors that play removal. Like if you're playing against blue-red, you probably shouldn't just go like turn 2 Ranger class, turn 3 level up unless you have nothing else to do. But people do that and they get in trouble for it. The real appeal of this card is that if you do get to level 3, if you have invested 8 mana into it somehow, you did get to just start rattling cards off the top of your library. So it's another card advantage machine in the same vein as like the Great Henge or Vivian or the Augur of Autumn, the Courser of Krufix, stuff like that. But it takes a lot of investment to get there, and it doesn't happen every single game. But it's fine on rate. Like the 4 is 2 mana 2/2 that gives you like the Luminarch Aspirant ability, which can snowball out of control and give you a good lead. And then, yeah, level 3 is a nice mana sink if you have mana left over at some point. So I think this is a B. I think it's more valuable to more decks than Scavenging Ooze. So I'm going to put it above Scavenging Ooze as far as like random 2-drop creatures go in your green deck. But yeah, there are some matchups where you would rather have the Skoos. And then Boseiju is our last one. Interesting, because what this does is lets us sneak a disenchant into our cube without actually having to use a slot on Disenchant, right? You don't want Disenchant to be one of the 23 cards in your deck because sometimes you draw it and your opponent has no targets for it and it's a dead card, whereas Boseiju is never a dead card. And it does give us, again, I keep harping on this, we have powerful artifacts and enchantments that are worth destroying, but not so many that it's worth playing 2 or 3 dedicated disenchant effects. So finding ways to sneak artifact and enchantment removal into the cube without actually using an entire slot on it is nice. And yes, Boseiju is using an entire slot, but any deck can put this in. Any deck can put this in their 40 card deck and be happy playing it. Where should you pick it? You don't first pick Boseiju. You end up green and then you take Boseiju. I think I am going to put it as an A though. Same as I did with all of the other channel lands. I value them very highly. I think I would probably take this over Goose unless I know I definitely need the ramp. So A, as far as deck building goes, it's an S because it'll make your deck 100% of the time. But as far as like when you should draft it, it's more of an A quality card. So there we are. Every card in the monocolored section of the Unrestricted Cube. And this one's an interesting one because the S tier is Nissa and Great Henge, these just absurdly powerful top-end ramp cards, and then a bunch of mana dorks, which I think is appropriate. I think that is appropriate. And then you get down to the next section, which is a wide variety of effects, just big creatures, efficient threats, card advantage, ramp. Maybe this is why green is just dominating the way it is because it has so many powerful effects. But yeah, that's where I stand on green. That's where I stand on the Unrestricted Cube. I can't imagine anybody's even watching at this point anymore, but if you are, thanks for hanging out, and I hope you enjoyed this content. Let's go ahead and wrap up here. As always, if you want to go ahead and join us for an Unrestricted Cube draft, there's a link down below to our Discord. You can find us there. You can come chat. You can come play the Unrestricted Cube and form your own opinions about it. And yeah, that's going to do it for this series. So thanks for hanging out. I've enjoyed doing it and talking on hours on end about just random Magic cards. And yeah, let me know if you like this sort of content, if you want to see more like it. But that's going to go ahead and do it for this series. My name has been Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I will see you all next time.